if marriage was a giant slalom, I mean, I'm a bronze medal winner. You're a gold medal winner, right? I mean, I put it that way.
For 30 years, Johnny Carson walked out to that desk 5 nights a week and made it look effortless. Charming, sharp, impossibly cool. America went to bed with him. But the man behind that desk was a completely different story. This is Johnny Carson, the affairs that haunted late-night television's biggest star. The man behind the curtain. There is a particular kind of irony that follows someone who makes a living being likable. Johnny Carson could disarm anyone. He could make a nervous first-time guest feel like the funniest person in the room. He could land a joke so clean it left the audience gasping. He could sit back in that chair, tilt his head, and make 40 million people feel like he was talking directly to them. For 30 years, that combination of Midwestern ease and surgical comic timing made him the most powerful man in American late night. He launched careers with a single word. He tanked them with a single look. But the moment those studio lights went off, the warmth had a way of draining out of him. People who worked with Carson for years, decades in some cases, described the experience in almost identical terms. He was 2 different people. On one side of the curtain, the consummate host. On the other, a man who kept almost everyone at arm's length, who drank in ways that frightened those closest to him, and who left a trail of broken relationships that stretched from Nebraska to Malibu. Colleagues who interacted with him daily said he could go from generous and hilarious to cold and cutting without any warning and without any apparent awareness that he had done it. Those who loved him learned to live inside that uncertainty. What makes the Carson story so compelling isn't just that he had affairs. It's the pattern beneath them, the restlessness, the inability to be present in his own life, the emotional distance that seemed to follow him from marriage to marriage, like a shadow he could never outrun. Other powerful men in entertainment had complicated personal lives. Carson's complications had a particular shape to them, a particular quality of repetition, as if the same scene kept playing out with different actors and the same painful ending. 4 marriages, 3 sons he admitted he barely knew how to father, a parade of women, and a private life so thoroughly guarded that most of America had no idea any of it was happening. He did not do press about his personal relationships. He did not discuss his home life on the show. He built a wall between the public version of himself and everything else, and he maintained that wall with the same discipline he brought to the performance. The Tonight Show ran from 1962 to 1992. In that time, Carson gave exactly 1 interview about his personal life to a major publication. 1. Everything else, he buried. But the people who were there, wives, lawyers, friends, colleagues, eventually started talking. And what they had to say was a long way from the man on television. Biographies, memoirs, documentary interviews, and court records have gradually filled in the picture that Carson spent his career keeping dark. The version that emerged is more interesting and considerably more troubled than anything that ever aired on NBC. To understand how any of this happened, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to Hollywood, not to New York, to a small town in Nebraska and a woman named Ruth. Ruth, the shadow that followed him everywhere. Johnny Carson was born in 1925 in Corning, Iowa, and grew up in Norfolk, Nebraska. His father, Homer, was a quiet, steady man who worked for a local power company. His mother, Ruth, was something else entirely. By every account from people who knew the family, and from Carson himself, Ruth ran the household like a general runs a campaign. She was strict, demanding, and most importantly, emotionally closed off in a way that left a mark on her children that never fully healed. According to people who were close to Carson throughout his adult life, Ruth simply did not show warmth, not to her husband, and not to her sons. Carson's first wife, Jodi Walcott, heard stories about Ruth's temperament even before she had met the woman herself. Stories about broken dishes and a temper that could fill an entire room. When Ruth and Homer eventually visited the Tonight Show set in New York, a staff member who met her that day later recalled feeling genuinely sad for Johnny in the moment. That was the impression Ruth made on people. Not pride, not warmth, but a kind of cold, impenetrable wall. When Carson premiered as host of The Tonight Show on October 1st, 1962, a journalist sat with Ruth to watch the broadcast. When Carson's opening monologue finished, Ruth stood up from her chair, said it wasn't funny, and walked into the kitchen. That was it. No celebration, no acknowledgement of what her son had just accomplished. A few years later, a Time magazine profile on Carson opened with that exact scene. Ruth watching the show, unimpressed, heading to the kitchen. Carson was devastated that millions of people would read it. His wife at the time, Joanne, later confirmed that it hurt him badly. Ruth had been publicly, casually dismissive of the man who was quickly becoming the most watched host in America. He tried for years to win her over. He sent his parents on a fully paid trip to Europe. When he called afterward to ask about the trip, Ruth's response was brief. She said it was good to be home, and not much else. He sent her a mink coat. She returned it. It was, she told him, too fancy for Nebraska. Burt Reynolds, who was a close friend of Carson's for years, later wrote that Carson talked about his mother often, that she was the wound he kept returning to, the explanation he reached for when things went wrong. Carson called her Lady Macbeth. He told Reynolds directly that his marriages failed because of what she had done to him. He would use an unprintable word to describe her, then repeat the point, as if saying it enough times might make it true. When Ruth died, Carson did not go to the funeral. His response to the news, shared later by multiple people who were with him at the time, was to say, with something close to relief, that the wicked witch was dead. But here's what made the story sadder. After Ruth's death, Carson found a large box she had kept stored away. Inside it were dozens of clippings about him. Articles, profiles, reviews of reviews. She had collected every mention of him she could find, and never once told him she was proud. Henry Bushkin, who served as Carson's personal lawyer and closest confidant for nearly 2 decades, put it plainly. Carson was a child of an emotionally unreachable mother, and as long as she lived, he chased her approval without ever receiving it. That chase, Bushkin believed, never really ended. It just changed shape, and the women in Carson's life bore the weight of it. Because what Carson learned from Ruth, or perhaps what he failed to learn, was how to be present for the people who needed him. And in marriage, after marriage, that absence would be the thing that broke everything apart. Jodi Walcott, the first wife, the first fracture. Johnny Carson met Jodi Walcott when both of them were students at the University of Nebraska. They married in 1949. He was 23 years old. In the years that followed, they had 3 sons, Christopher, Richard, and Corey. And Carson worked his way up through radio and regional television, slowly building the kind of credentials that would eventually put him in front of a national audience. From the outside, it looked like the American dream. Young couple, growing family, a man on the rise. But the biography, Carson the Magnificent, written by entertainment journalist Bill Zamey and completed posthumously with co-author Mike Thomas, paints a portrait of those early years that looks nothing like that. The marriage was volatile from early on. Both Carson and Jodi had affairs. There were arguments, loud ones, in front of other couples. There were long stretches of silence, of resentment that built until it had nowhere left to go. Alcohol was part of the picture from the start, though not yet in the way it would become later. When Carson drank, even in small amounts, something shifted in him. He had an extremely low tolerance and would reach a state of intoxication very quickly, and when he got there, the person who emerged was nothing like the charming man people knew during daylight hours. Zemi described it as a kind of internal replacement, as though whoever Carson had been a moment before simply ceased to exist, replaced by something unrecognizable. In the mornings, Carson would come back to himself. He would feel the weight of the night before, feel genuine remorse, and struggle with what he had done or said. But the remorse never translated into lasting change. By 1962, Carson had landed the job that would define the rest of his life: host of The Tonight Show, taking over from Jack Paar. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, and it appears to have been the final weight on a marriage that was already struggling to stay upright. Fame accelerated everything: the access, the attention, the late nights, the world suddenly revolving around Johnny Carson. None of it made a faithful husband easier to maintain. The show demanded everything he had, and then more. Carson later said, in one of his most honest public admissions, that he was married to The Tonight Show. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. The people who watched him during those early years at NBC understood that the show was the relationship that mattered most, and everything else was arranged around it. Carson and Jodi divorced in 1963 after 14 years of marriage. He had already met his next wife. But the story of his first marriage didn't end there. The consequences of those years, the emotional unavailability, the drinking, the distance, would ripple outward through his sons in ways that only became visible much later. And one of those sons would pay an especially painful price for the kind of father Carson had been during those years. What happened with his 3 boys, particularly the eldest, is one of the darker threads in the Carson story. But before we get there, the second marriage was already beginning, and it would become one of the most complicated and, eventually, most humiliating chapters of his life. Joanne Copeland, The Apartment, The Break-In, and Frank Gifford. Carson met Joanne Copeland in 1960. She was working as a flight attendant for Pan American World Airways, and their paths crossed while Carson was still hosting the game show Who Do You Trust? A title, in hindsight, that functions almost as a punchline. They married in 1963, the same year his divorce from Jodi was finalized. Joanne was, by most accounts, a striking and capable woman. She was a television personality in her own right, and when she met Carson, she had her own career to consider. But she fell for him anyway. Partly, she later admitted, because of early recordings she had seen of him filling in as Tonight Show host before the job was officially his. She saw what he could be on television, and she believed in it. Her father had even tried to set them up earlier after meeting Carson at a jazz club. Joanne was skeptical at first that a relationship between 2 television people on competing networks could work. She eventually let herself be convinced. Their marriage lasted 9 years, from 1963 to 1972. And what happened inside that marriage, on both sides, was considerably messier than either of them publicly let on at the time. Both Carson and Joanne had affairs during their marriage. Carson's were a series of dalliances with various women, consistent with a pattern that would continue for the rest of his romantic life. Joanne's, when Carson eventually discovered the extent of them, sent him into a spiral that would become one of the most bizarre and talked about episodes in his personal history. Carson had begun to suspect that Joanne was involved with Frank Gifford. the NFL star and broadcaster who was one of the most recognizable faces in American sports at the time. The suspicion became an obsession, and rather than confront it in any conventional way, Carson did something that his lawyer, Henry Bushkin, would spend years trying to make sense of. He decided to break into Joanne's apartment to look for evidence. Bushkin, who had only recently begun working for Carson at that point, he was 27, just starting out, was recruited to join the mission. He was deeply opposed to it. Breaking into someone's property was illegal, regardless of who was doing it or why. But Carson was not in a state to hear objections. He had hired a locksmith through channels Bushkin preferred not to examine too closely, and the plan went forward. Inside the apartment, Carson found what he was looking for. There were photographs of Gifford around the place. There was other evidence of an ongoing personal relationship. It was, by Bushkin's recounting, more than enough for Carson. He broke down. The man who had spent years being unfaithful himself stood in his estranged wife's apartment, surrounded by evidence of her own affair, and wept. Carson, somewhere between the grief and the alcohol that followed, managed to find his characteristic dark humor in the situation. He made a remark to Bushkin about Gifford's athletic versatility, noting that Gifford played 3 positions on the football field, while he could never get Joanne to go along with more than 2. Even in that state, the comedian couldn't fully disappear. But the joke didn't cover what he was feeling, and Bushkin saw it clearly. What followed that night was a long drinking session. Carson and Ed McMahon, his longtime Tonight Show announcer and companion, processing the wreckage together in the way they apparently often processed difficult things. The affair between Joanne and Gifford was never publicly confirmed, and the two never became a couple afterward. But the episode crystallized something about Carson's relationship with his own behavior, the way he could hold others to a standard that he consistently failed to meet himself, without appearing to notice the contradiction. Joanne, for her part, was honest in later years about what the marriage had cost her. She described Carson's drinking as something that transformed him into an entirely different person. She said she had been genuinely frightened during some of those episodes, that he could go from calm to something uncontrollable without warning, and that there was no predicting what would happen when he was in that state. She sought help through therapy. She endured. Eventually, she stopped. The divorce settlement, when it came, was relatively straightforward compared to what would follow with his third wife, a fact that perhaps reflected both the era and the speed with which Carson moved on. Joanne later quipped that Carson joked, after the split, that she had left him with a hassock and a hairnet. She said she would remember that line forever. Whatever else she took from those 9 years, she at least left with the earliest recordings of Carson hosting The Tonight Show, which she had held onto from the very beginning. In 2007, 2 years after his death, she released those tapes commercially, the only existing record of Carson learning to be the host he eventually became. They divorced in 1972. Carson was already involved with the woman who would become wife number 3. And if the Joanne years were about suspicion and confrontation and a break-in that shouldn't have happened, the third marriage would be about something subtler and, in some ways, worse. A man who tried to buy his way out of the damage he was doing and found that even a Rolls-Royce isn't worth very much when the person receiving it can't trust the person giving it. Joanna Holland, Gifts, Guilt, and the $20 million Exit. Carson met Joanna Holland in 1972, while his divorce from Joanne Copeland was still being processed. They started seeing each other, and by the end of that year they were married. Joanna was a model, striking, poised, a figure in Manhattan's social world. She had a son from a previous marriage, and when Carson eventually moved the Tonight Show operation to California, She and her son moved with him. By this point in his life, Carson was the undisputed king of late-night television. The Tonight Show was generating extraordinary revenue for NBC. His face was on the cover of magazines. He was one of the most powerful people in the entertainment industry. And privately, he was still drinking, still unfaithful, and still emotionally unavailable in the way he had always been. The affairs during his marriage to Joanna were not a secret to those who were close to him. What was notable was how Carson responded to them, not with any apparent intention to stop, but with gifts, extravagant ones. He bought Joanna diamonds. He set her up in a luxury apartment at the Pierre, one of the most exclusive addresses in New York. He bought her a Rolls-Royce Corniche. The generosity was real, and by any ordinary measure, extraordinary. But Joanna and those around the marriage understood what it was. Not love expressed, but guilt managed. The drinking during these years reached a kind of low point. Joanna later described a period she referred to as his black drunk phase, a time when she was genuinely afraid of what could happen when he had been drinking. She said anything could set him off during those episodes, that there was no stability to hold on to. She tried to hold the marriage together. In her own words, she said she really tried. In 1982, the extent of Carson's drinking became public record when he was stopped while driving under the influence. He was in a DeLorean. He pleaded no contest to a misdemeanor charge, was fined around $600, and was placed on 3 years of probation. He had acknowledged his problem years earlier. In a 1979 interview on 60 Minutes, he was candid about the fact that alcohol affected him badly, that rather than becoming fun and gregarious like some people, he went the opposite direction. Knowing it and stopping it turned out to be very different things. By 1983, after 11 years of marriage, Joanna filed for divorce. The proceedings dragged on for nearly 2 years. When the settlement was finalized in 1985, it ran to 80 pages. Joanna walked away with a reported $20 million in assets and $35,000 per month in spousal support, a figure that had been dramatically reduced from her original request of $220,000 per month. Carson, characteristically, turned the divorce into material. He made jokes about it on the show. It was what he did. Pain became performance, and performance made the pain manageable, at least in public. He remained single from 1985 to 1987. And then, on a beach in Malibu, he met someone. But before getting to his 4th and final wife, there's another story that happened during the years of these marriages, one that unfolded not in his home, but on the Tonight Show stage, and involved a woman who had been one of his closest professional allies. That story, and the way it ended, says something about Carson that even his marriages don't fully capture. Joan Rivers, the betrayal that cut deepest. Joan Rivers came up in comedy during an era when women simply were not supposed to be doing what she was doing. She was aggressive, sharp, willing to go places that made people uncomfortable, and completely relentless about her craft. Carson recognized that quality early. He gave her an enormous boost. When she made her first Tonight Show appearance in 1965, Carson told his audience directly, on air, that she was going to be a star. For a comedian trying to break through at that time, those words from Johnny Carson were about as powerful as anything could be. Networks took notice, club bookers took notice, and Rivers took the momentum and ran with it. Over the following years, she became his regular guest host on Monday nights, which gave her extraordinary national exposure and helped build her into a genuine draw in her own right. She was filling seats in Las Vegas. She was selling out theaters. The Joan Rivers that America eventually came to know, fearless, unstoppable, the woman who made everyone a target, including herself, was, in significant part, a product of the platform Carson built for her. Their relationship was close enough that later, in the years after both of their careers had moved on, rumors circulated about how close it had actually been. Rivers herself addressed those rumors in a book, suggesting the two had been more than professionally intertwined at some point during her marriage to her husband Edgar Rosenberg. Carson, who never discussed his personal life publicly, said nothing on the subject. Rivers also made public comments about Carson's personal life over the years that suggested a level of familiarity that went beyond what you'd expect from a professional relationship. Whether any of that was grounded in fact or in Rivers simply being Rivers, using every available detail for maximum effect, is something only the two of them ever really knew. What is certain is that the professional relationship was deeply meaningful to both of them, and that the way it ended left a mark that neither of them ever fully got over. In 1986, Rivers was offered her own late-night show on Fox. It was a genuine opportunity, something that almost no woman in television had been given at that scale. She took it. What she did not do, and this is where the story takes its sharp turn, was tell Carson herself, in advance, directly. The mechanics of how information was communicated in those days and who spoke to whom matter here. Rivers's husband, Edgar Rosenberg, managed much of her professional dealings. According to Henry Bushkin's account, Rosenberg later claimed he had tried to reach Bushkin to arrange a call between Rivers and Carson to discuss the Fox offer before it was finalized. Bushkin said no such call ever came through. Whether Rosenberg genuinely made the attempt, or whether something else went wrong in the chain of communication, was never fully resolved. What was resolved, definitively and without appeal, was Carson's reaction. Carson found out from somewhere else. By the time Rivers called him, the conversation was over almost before it started. He hung up the phone and never spoke to her again. Not once, in the years that followed, did he take her call or respond to her attempts to reach him. He banned her from appearing on any NBC program. Her Fox show was cancelled after its first season. Her husband, Edgar Rosenberg, caught between the wreckage of the Fox venture, the public scrutiny, and the personal weight of everything that had gone wrong, ended his own life in 1987. Rivers was left to process an enormous amount of grief at once, and the door to Carson remained permanently shut. In later years, Rivers was honest about her role in how things had unfolded. She acknowledged that she should have told him sooner, directly, rather than letting him find out another way. She said it with the clarity of someone who had had years to think it over. She was not entirely without blame, and she knew it. But the silence from Carson, permanent, unbroken until the day he died, was its own kind of verdict. The documentary Johnny Carson, King of Late Night, captured the filmmaker Peter Jones, reflecting on what the Rivers situation meant to Carson. He described it as something that genuinely broke Carson's heart, that beyond all the marriages, the Joan Rivers rupture hit him at a depth that few things did. There was something about that betrayal, real or perceived, that he could not move past, and so he simply moved on and left her behind permanently. Carson never publicly explained himself. That was consistent with how he operated. Walls up, silence maintained, the interior locked away. But those who knew him well could see what the loss had cost him, even if he would never say so. What was waiting for him in the years after the Rivers fallout and after the wreckage of 3 marriages was something genuinely unexpected. A 4th marriage that actually seemed to work. Alexis Maas, the quiet love he never expected. The story of Johnny Carson's 4th marriage is almost jarring in its simplicity, given everything that preceded it. He met Alexis Maas on a beach in Malibu in the mid-1980s, somewhere in the stretch of time between the end of his marriage to Joanna and the years leading up to his retirement. She was a former stock brokerage employee from Pittsburgh, not a celebrity, not part of the Hollywood machinery. She was, by most accounts, simply a person. And that apparently was what Carson needed. No industry connections to negotiate, no competing career to manage around, no shared world that could collapse and take the relationship with it. They married in 1987. The ceremony was held outside Carson's home in Malibu, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The guest list was almost comically small. His brother Dick, the judge who officiated, and the judge's wife. Alexis's parents participated by speakerphone from the East Coast. Carson had specifically asked for no publicity. There were no cameras, no press, no announcement. The man who had spent 30 years living under the most public eye in American broadcasting wanted the most important day of his private life kept completely private. Producer George Schlatter, who had known Carson for years, later described Alexis as the real love of Carson's life. She gave him what none of the previous marriages had quite managed to provide. Something steady, something quiet, something that wasn't performing. Carson retired from The Tonight Show in May of 1992, after 30 years and 4,531 broadcasts. The final episode was one of the most watched television events of that era. In his final moments on air, Carson was subdued in a way that surprised people who expected grand gestures. He thanked the audience. He said a brief, direct goodbye. And then he went home to Malibu and largely disappeared from public life. No guest appearances, no comeback specials, no late-night victory laps. He simply stopped and stayed stopped. He spent those retirement years with Alexis. He took up sailing. He developed a genuine interest in astronomy and marine biology. He learned Swahili for trips to Africa, a small and touching detail that suggested something had loosened in him. A curiosity, a willingness to be present in a way that hadn't always been available before. Those who encountered him in those years described a man who was quieter, more content, genuinely at peace in a way the earlier decades hadn't offered. He was done proving himself to anyone, and the relief of that seemed to suit him. But the past had a way of surfacing. His surviving sons, Christopher and Corey, had grown up largely without a father who knew how to be one. Carson, toward the end of his life, acknowledged this. According to Henry Bushkin's account, at some point after the death of his son Richard, Carson reached out to Christopher and Corey and apologized, told them he was sorry he hadn't been there when they needed him. It was a late reckoning, but it was a real one. Richard's death in June of 1991 had hit Carson harder than almost anything else in his life. Richard, known to family as Rick, had struggled with significant personal difficulties during the years when Carson might have been able to help, and Carson had largely not been there. The relationship between father and son had been strained for a long time. There had been an incident at a Tonight Show anniversary event where things had deteriorated badly between them. Carson, who reacted intensely to others drinking even as he struggled with his own relationship with alcohol, had gone after Rick publicly in front of witnesses. It was the kind of moment a person doesn't recover from easily, and neither of them had. When Rick's car went off an embankment near Morro Bay, California, on June 24, 1991, at the age of 39, Carson was left with no possibility of repair. He delivered a tribute to his son on The Tonight Show, a few minutes of unguarded, clearly genuine grief, and those who watched said it was one of the only times they had ever seen Carson's real interior on display. He didn't try to joke through it. He didn't deflect. He just said what he needed to say, and you could see what it cost him. According to biographer Mike Thomas, Carson was never the same after Rick's death. He carried that grief to the end of his life. He had been, by his own admission, married to The Tonight Show for 30 years. And that marriage, the most successful and sustaining relationship of his life, had come with a cost that he only fully understood when it was too late to do anything about it. Carson died on January 23, 2005, at age 79. The cause was respiratory failure brought on by emphysema. Alexis had remained at his side. She has kept largely out of the public eye ever since. What was left behind? When you add it all up, 4 marriages, 3 failed, a string of affairs that ran through most of his adult life, estrangements from his sons, a rupture with Joan Rivers that never healed, a relationship with alcohol that shaped and damaged nearly everything he touched. The picture that emerges is of a man in profound conflict with himself. And yet, he was also, by any fair measure, one of the most gifted broadcasters who ever sat behind a desk. The ability to make people feel comfortable, to create space for a conversation that didn't exist a moment before, to find the joke in something that wasn't funny. Those gifts were real, and they didn't disappear just because the life behind them was complicated. The Tonight Show won 6 Emmy Awards. It received the Television Academy's Governor's Award in 1980 and a Peabody Award in 1985. When Carson finally retired, NBC reportedly stood to lose $50 million a year in revenue. No single personality on American television, before or since, has held that kind of sustained commercial power for that length of time. Carson himself, at various points, acknowledged the contradiction. After leaving The Tonight Show, he told People magazine something that stayed with a lot of people who read it. If he had given as much to his marriages as he gave to The Tonight Show, he probably would have had a very different life at home. That's as honest as he ever got in public. The implication was clear, that he knew what the show had cost him, that the bargain had been made, and he understood the terms of it, even if he hadn't always been able to do anything about it. He spent 30 years being the most reliable presence in millions of American living rooms, and almost none of that presence was available to the people in his own house. Henry Bushkin, who spent 18 years in the closest possible proximity to Carson before being unceremoniously let go over a business dispute in 1988, put it in terms that have stayed in the record ever since. He described a man who was the child of an emotionally unreachable mother, a man who had learned early that love was something you had to earn, and who never quite stopped trying to earn it, even when the people offering it were right in front of him. Bushkin watched Carson's marriages collapse one after another. He watched him react to betrayal with a fury that seemed disproportionate, given his own conduct. He watched him win everything the entertainment industry could offer and feel, at the end of the day, like something was still missing. The 4 wives knew a version of Carson that the audience never saw. Jodi got the young man with ambition and a drinking problem, and too much restlessness to stay faithful. Joanne got the rising star who needed her to function as a buffer between him and his own staff, and then held her to a standard of fidelity he wasn't meeting himself. Joanna got the king of late night in full bloom, the gifts, the excess, the chaos, the fear. Alexis got what was left over, which turned out to be, by most accounts, the best version of him there was. Johnny Carson said it himself, quietly, in a rare, unguarded moment. "I don't have much of a talent for happiness. I never have. My mother saw to that." Whether that was entirely true, or partly an excuse, or something in between, only Carson knew. But what the record shows is a man who was enormous in public and unfinished in private, who built one of the longest-running and most successful careers in the history of American television, and who went home every night to a life that was, for most of those 30 years, considerably more painful than the one the cameras showed. Late-night television remembers the desk, the chair, the band, the curtain parting. That's the Johnny Carson America knew. The other one, the one with the affairs and the drinking and the unresolved grief and the mother he couldn't please, was always there too, just out of frame, waiting for the lights to go down. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.